And I have Opeyemi Agbaje, the CEO of RTC Advisory. He joins us now as we look at some of these pertinent issues. Opeyemi, quite a lot witnessed today in terms of policy and what we will need going down the line. How do you think Nigeria is shaping up to be?
Well, one positive I took from this particular election is that the three frontrunners, in my view, came across as being basically competent in terms of economic policy and the ideas for the Nigerian economy. And beyond all of the campaigns and the politics, if you go down to the level of policy, you will find some kind of consensus amongst those we would agree were the three frontrunners. So we all know that there are some imperatives in terms of economic policy and management, in terms of poverty, unemployment, the social scenario, in terms of security, in terms of those key priorities. And I suspect that, as I've said in some quarters, the worst of the three frontrunners might be slightly better than the status quo. So that would be a positive. Beyond that, it remains to be seen who will be elected and what he would actually deliver. But if we wanted to be optimistic, we could say that, we are likely to be slightly better in terms of policy and economic management than we were in the last 8 years.
I think that has been more or less a consensus for many people that have been observing the polls, from analysts to even foreign observers. And in terms of the big ticket issues, clearly there's the issue about the fiscal condition of the country, the very controversial fuel subsidies. All of the major contenders have suggested that they're going to do something about that. But of course, many will suggest that we've heard that before. So we'll see. Fingers crossed on that. And then, of course, the issue around the oil sector and how Nigeria's production has been hit. So we'll see what happens.
Let me bring some very important area here, because I'm looking at some of the top 10 risks as listed by Allianz Global Corporate Specialty. They had a risk parameter for Nigeria, and one of the major things that they listed in there is changes in legislation and regulation, and they say that has been a problem in Nigeria, and they see that as it's going to be a problem even down the line this year. And I'd like us to look at that, and in terms of, yes, a government might have the right policy, but how are they communicating that, and are they weighing the impact it's going to have on the economy in the execution? We've just seen a policy that is affecting the whole country right now in terms of the cash redesign policy, and it might be good intentions from the government, but the implementation, however, is making people feel it's affecting businesses and the economy at large. And I'd like you to speak to that, looking into the next administration and the type of policy implementation that we would like to see going forward in the next administration.
Okay, let me focus first of all, to take off the conversation, on the biggest issues. The biggest issues are the fuel subsidy and, leading to that, the revenue crisis that we appear to have, and the revenue/debt crisis. So what are you going to do about those? Now, the second issue is the FX scenario, especially what are you going to do about the two or multiple exchange rates, and how are you going to manage foreign currency? We have, related to that, the issue of oil sector policy, beyond the subsidy, how are you going to manage investments, implementation of the petroleum industry bill, all of those big issues. I think that, like I said, we've had people claim, all the three major frontrunners claim they're going to remove the subsidy. One of them has been particularly bold in saying he's going to abolish the dual exchange rates. Someone has advocated privatization of the NNPC. He has been consistent in that regard, and that's Atiku Abubakar.
Sure.
Tinubu has been very direct in saying, I'm going to take off the fuel subsidy. I think Obi has said the same thing in a more careful manner. So, like I said, on those big issues, there appears to be consensus in terms of rhetoric. Now, in terms of actions, you can't predict that. What's the capacity of the government in terms of policy? What's the political will? What will be the electoral mathematics for your government when you're in power? Because for some of these things, you will need legislative support. So all of those variables we will determine today. But my sense is that in terms of the direction of policy and the imperatives for policy, there is a lot more clarity going into 2023, a new government, than we've had in the last 8 years.
Okay,
That would be my sense.
Let me bring in other guests who are joining us now. We have Matthias Chika Mordi. He's an Adjunct Professor of the School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. And we also have Egie Akpata, the Chairman of Skymark Partners. If you're just hearing me in studio here, I have Wole Famiriwa and Mr. Opeyemi Agbaje. And let me start with Mr. Chika Mordi. Your thoughts around the policy direction that we're seeing and what we can expect going into the next administration, or what Nigeria needs, the type of policy communication we need in the next administration.
Well, thank you for having me. You have three. Your question has three aspects to it. So, what I think Nigeria would need, what the candidates are declaring as their policy, and the third part it's slightly maybe subjective. I heard Opeyemi, the centers we have visited, and Opeyemi, greetings to you. We go back a long way. The critical thing here really is, and I don't want to be cynical, if we go back to past elections, and this election is not much different, candidates have had very interesting declaratory policies. I characterize them as declaratory because they say this is what we will do, and a lot of it is really performative. And when they get into office, they very often haven't pursued those policies. So I don't attach too much currency to the policies that they at this point they declare that they would have. What I think is a better predictor of how they operate in office is looking at their past and trying to the pattern in action of their past, and trying from there to infer the sort of ideological pinning that they have to policy. And in that sense, you have, you could reach conclusions that, to my mind, will be better predictors of what they will do in office. The four major candidates, as has been said earlier on, all have policies that are similar in many ways. There's a consensus around what is wrong in terms of the economy and the areas that improvements can be made. Now, the details are obviously different. They're not very granular. But more importantly, the governing philosophy is what will determine how they govern. And what do I mean by this? If you think of the Obasanjo regime, where Atiku was part of, there's a lot of liberalization, there's a lot of privatization. The approach and the philosophy was about minimizing the involvement of government in business and trying to get government out of the way to allow competition, allow the markets to work. There's little doubt that Alhaji Atiku would continue, Abubakar would continue that sort of thing if he goes into office. We could quarrel about the end results, but definitely you would agree with me that government has not been a force for good in business in Nigeria. And if anything, at the moment where we have the sort of fiscal crisis and constrictions that we face, reducing the size of government and the cost of governance will be a positive thing. Now, if you go to the other major candidate, and that's one of the other major candidates, and that's Shivaji Boji Tinubu, he has shown a progressive streak. Progressive not in the sense, this is something they very quickly attach to their policies, but there's some progressive streak in terms of what government should be doing and the size of government. So very often you'll see government is sometimes a solution or preferred as the solution to certain things. There is an anti-privatization posture, and this is consistent with progressive economics. And I would not expect to see less of this, right, should he go into power. With Peter Obi is slightly more difficult because we've not seen, we have 8 years in an amber state, but beyond that, we've not seen something at the national level or something that comprises the ideological structure of a major political party, as was the case with Asiwaju Bola Tinubu under AD and AC and the various incarnations that led to APC. But one thing is clear from what he says is that also he's market friendly, maybe not to the extreme of, not that I wouldn't call it extreme, but maybe not to the level of deregulation that I would see with Atiku Abubakar, but somewhere maybe in between. So this is sort of my take, what I perceive from looking at their pattern in action of past records and where they're coming from philosophically.
Well, when I think about this point, and I heard Chika mention governing philosophy, and I asked myself, what type of leader does Nigeria need? And quite often, some people have suggested that Nigeria actually needs a benevolent dictator, if we can find one, because there are so many moving parts in terms of the legislature, the civil service, as we spoke of earlier today, that to get things done, you either have to be a very skillful diplomat, or you have to have some semblance of brute force to get your way. The type of force that you will expect from a military leader, which we've seen, for example, in the case of former President Abacha.
Let me comment. I like the Chika's attempt to define the governing philosophy, and I have done the same. So I have characterized the 4 leading candidates, Bola Tinubu as 3 of them are clearly market inclined, and that's Tinubu, Atiku, and Obi. But they have different tenors to their inclination to markets. I call Bola Tinubu a market welfareist, and that's what Chika is basically alluding to in terms of the progressive bent, the pro-masses bent to their market policy. They tend to want to use government while believing in markets. And if you look at Bola Tinubu's record in Lagos, he has believed in markets a lot. He's tried to do PPPs. He's tried to use pro-market approaches and all of that. But he's basically a market welfareist. Balances his faith in the market with a populist inclination to do things for the majority. Atiku is clearly a market capitalist. And I agree with Chika's description. He's very pro-capital, he's very pro-big business, he wants to deregulate and all of that. Peter Obi is and I agree that he's the one who is more difficult to define, but I define him as market entrepreneurial. So his background as an entrepreneur, he has a less dirigist approach in terms of you can't particularly categorize him in terms of his governing philosophy, but if you look at his background, you know that he's clearly a market-based person. If you look at the type of advisors around him, you know he's clearly a market-based person. But you might expect an entrepreneurial approach. Kwakwanso, I suspect, will be more statist, pro-state in his policy dispensation. Now, to Wally's question, what kind of leader do we need? In terms of economic policy, I'm clear in my mind, we need someone who's pro-markets, but who also, because of the state of the social indices in the country, poverty, unemployment, huge state dysfunctionality, is committed to using the state to further the welfare of the population.
Let me bring Egie into the conversation. Egie, you listen to all what has been said so far. In your view, what would you say about the political will that is needed to address the major challenges, major structural challenges that we're facing in the country, and what do these candidates? What do you think the candidates offer?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me on the show. I mean, again, I think it's difficult to judge some of these people based on what they've said. Some of what they've said might just be campaign rhetoric, and when they get into office, they might run into technical difficulties for all kinds of reasons. Particularly for those who have not operated at the federal level, there are a number of levers a federal president has that the state governor doesn't have. For instance, things around the economy, the currency, more macroeconomic things, which they probably don't have to think about as governors, whereas as a president, you have to be worried about that. So some of what they're saying might not necessarily work out the way as planned, particularly the strong opposition, either from organized labor or from the legislative house. But I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned, though, about what some of them said on campaign trail is around Nigeria's debt. That's the problem. 3 out of 4 candidates have categorically said they will restructure in debt. That to me is extremely dangerous stuff. If any of those 3 get in and go down that route, I'm not sure the outcome will be worth the effort. But again, it sounds popular to say you wouldn't pay back your debts and you pay less than you're supposed to pay, but it has significant structural impact on the entire economy, way beyond what the candidates probably have been told that something like that would have.
Wale?
Yeah, Egie, if I might come in, I think the restructuring, just to be clear, there's a difference between some who are proposing restructuring the debt in terms of the tenure, in terms of the terms, as against restructuring in terms of shaving off repayments or cutting down the repayment absolute terms, right? That is very dangerous, and I quite frankly, I don't think the country can even afford it. We have to go back to creditors just to keep the lights on. You know what I mean by this is very obvious to everyone. There's a fiscal crisis, right? So if you look at the revenue we're getting, and you think of 3 buckets, right, in terms of capital expenditure, recurrent expenditure, and debt servicing, the revenue barely covers any of those 3 buckets, right? So we have to borrow just to make up the shortfalls. Now, if you begin to renege and try to force a shave on your debt, your creditors are going to lose patience. So that fiscal space doesn't exist. They don't have the luxury of doing that. They will have to address that. And I feel Opeyemi was a very important point, and that's that the kind of interventions that the government would have to do, even if you have a statist approach or you don't have a statist approach, there are necessary interventions. The problem is, how do you fund those interventions? And I mean, there's some latent revenue increasing opportunities that are obvious that the new government can unlock. The most obvious ones, for example, oil production could easily increase, right? We could see double-digit increases, and that would dramatically alter the revenue position in terms of foreign exchange and in terms of government revenue. And there are other things like obviously subsidy removal. So a determined government can do that if they have the political space to do it. And it's one, and you know, when we talk about declaratory policies and actual policies, part of it is not because the motive was changed or because there's any sort of negative intention, but it's just the reality of political governance. And so you have to pivot to deal with the mechanisms around you, the political parties around you, and the tools that you actually have that you could use to govern. And which is why, again, I go back to that. I attach more currency to how they will think of governing and what they will make than what they say.
Okay. Let me throw this question to everybody, because at the end of the day, like Opeyemi mentioned, it's one of the most important areas that we want to see as a nation. And it's looking at how each of these candidates could chart a path to fiscal sustainability. You know, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you think each of the candidates could know that.
Well, first of all, I mean, everybody has made it clear. We have a whole fiscal challenge. We've gotten to a revenue. I mean, clearly revenues have to go up in the short term. And I agree, there's some easy steps. I think the subsidy is the fastest way to eliminate 6 to 7 trillion of expenditure.
Yeah.
And then on the upside, you can easily reduce the so-called oil theft, which is another leakage. and increase actual production, which is an increase to revenue. And then, and in this regard, Bola Tinubu, who dramatically increased revenue in Lagos State, would have significant experience, relevant experience in that regard. We clearly have to increase revenues in the short term. We clearly have to have conversations with our creditors and ensure that we secure the fiscal space to do what is right. And then we have to look at taxation in the short to medium term. We need to look at all the governance structures and the expenditure profile of federal government agencies. We have to go back to the so-called Onosoi report in terms of, do we really need this or that or that or that? Is there wastage across the field? So that's the path to fiscal sustainability. First, rationalizing expenditure, what makes sense. Two, increasing revenues, and then redirecting revenues. Clearly, we're in an unsustainable position today in terms of the proportion of revenues that goes to servicing debt. And so all of that indicates that. But then the other thing that has to happen, which hasn't happened in the last 8 years, is that economic productivity has to go up. GDP growth has to rise again to the region of 6 to 7 to 8%, such that government revenues can rise with it, investments can rise with it, and then the country can become more fiscally sustainable. So I think, and then each of them has some advantages that they have identified. So for Atiku, for instance, his own low-hanging fruit is privatize NNPC. To the point that, to the extent that that is a huge revenue source, can release significant revenue in the short term into the federal purse. That can also be a low-hanging fruit. And like I said, he's a market capitalist, so that's where he will be looking to. Tinubu, for obvious reasons, will be looking to increasing tax revenues and restructuring government. And Peter Obi will probably be asking himself questions such as, how does Chinese government, Indian government, Malaysian government generate their own revenues? What can we learn from these countries? So they have different tenors. I think each of them has a pathway. I think they have different pathways. But I think in the end, what is primary to everybody is that we have to stop oil theft, we have to remove the subsidy, and we have to find ways to increase revenues in the short term, while engaging.
Let me hear Egie's comments on this.
I actually was going to send this to Egie as well, because I think Egie will be in a good position to help us appreciate why the status quo is not an option in terms of the fiscal position of the government. So Egie, maybe you can take it up from there. Your perspective on what the fiscal crisis really presents to the next Nigerian leader, and if nothing is done, potentially what can we be talking about, given what we've seen in other countries on the continent and elsewhere?
Well, I think, my advice to the next president is, the first thing to do is totally take off the table the idea of any kind of renegotiation or anything to do with debt. That's the first thing. And there's a reason why I say that, right? In the world of debt, nobody wants anything that starts with R sounding beside your name. Restructure, renegotiate, any funny sounding thing that is anything but doing what you agreed to do before does not work. So that's step one. And there are many structural reasons why that has to be the case, because not only does Nigerian government rely on borrowing, Nigerian corporates borrow. The Nigerian corporates have over $4 billion of Eurobonds outstanding. If you lock them out of that market, that's a bit of a problem. So I think that's a very starting point. This idea of IMF idea that you should only have certain percentage of your revenue spent on debt service, so therefore go and default on all your debts and restructure. It doesn't work. It's not worked for anybody, and it definitely will not work here. Luckily for Nigeria, most of the debt is in local currency. And I don't know why Ghana did what they did, but there's no advantage of trying to touch your local currency debt. It's local currency debt, it's a pyramid scheme. You just keep issuing more debt to pay off all debt. And it'll keep happening effectively forever. No government tries to pay off the debt, just service it. and the Nigerian government has never defaulted on the service, so you just keep that way. In terms of the subsidy, I think there's a challenge with petrol subsidy. People keep talking about, you cut subsidy and you have savings for other things. There are no savings from subsidy. Every kobo of subsidy is borrowed. Because when you look at federal government revenue, by the time you pay salaries, pensions, overheads, and some debt service, your revenue is 100% gone. So everything you spend on subsidy and capex is 100% borrowed. And clearly the borrowing cannot continue at this rate. So clearly the subsidy definitely has to go. There's no way around that. What no government has ever tackled is restructuring of the federal government. It's just too large. There are too many agencies, and the costs are too high in non-important areas. If those costs were to pay doctors, teachers, policemen and things like that, you might say, okay, fine, is what the cost. But it's just bureaucracy. That has to be significantly addressed. If not, not much can happen. There's a lot of misunderstanding of how taxation works in Nigeria. There was some high commissioner from some country was saying they should double VAT or something. If you double VAT, the federal government will only get about 450 billion. They only get 15% of VAT. So if VAT is about 3 trillion, you double it, okay, they get an extra 450 billion. On a 20 trillion budget, it's a drop in the ocean. Meanwhile, VAT is a regressive tax. So it's the poor people that will bear it the most. So there are already issues around the structure of how Nigerian taxes work. Federal government only gets 15% of VAT. They get no personal income tax. And they get corporate tax that is almost at 33%. You can't raise that anymore. So you obviously have to get more companies into the tax net. The one of NNPC is a silent thing that has happened and nobody has noticed. NNPC is a 100% private company today. It has taken over all the assets and liabilities of federal government in the oil sector. Federal government no longer gets barrels of oil. That's gone. You get petroleum profit tax and royalties. And guess how much tax NNPC is going to pay? Next to nothing, because they're spending 2.4 trillion on roads. So the income structure of the federal government has changed. And I don't know if people are noticing that's happening. Now, in terms of the problem with debt in Nigeria, a lot of the analysis done by international agencies and rating agencies is they assume Nigeria is one big government, and they talk about government. They don't talk about federal government. And when you run those numbers for the federal government, who holds almost all the debt in Nigeria, all the Euro bonds of federal government, all the federal government bonds are federal government, the entire ways and means is federal government, you start to get a very different ratio. So the situation is really bad, but it's not so bad as to rock the boat. You keep servicing your debts, but in the meantime, you have to cut that structure down in a way, your cost structure in a way that shows you are serious about managing your costs. And also, obviously, certain sectors have to be opened up. There's really no reason why the government should still be subsidizing energy when the demand is there. Let the MITO work, let the sector work properly, and free up resources and time or energy of the government to focus on things like security and judiciary and things that cannot be done by the private sector. So in a summary, take off debt service from the any touching the debt from the discussion, because the amount of money the government borrows is so much, it can't afford to spook debt providers.
All right, now let me get Chika's take on this as well, that part to fiscal sustainability.
Yeah, again, I'll take off my departure point where Egie started really, and you raised some very critical points. On the NNPC thing, let's be clear, it's, there's something in substance and there's something that is nominal. So they could call it privatized or commercialized, but the reality is not being privatized. What I mean by that is the ownership is still 100% federal government. When the ownership is tradable and it goes outside, money is going to come in. And at that point, it's truly privatized, even if it's 40 or 60 or whatever percentage they do. And that will be a major income. And the other thing it will do, obviously, is to stop the NNPC from tying roads and undertaking public sector projects, which a private company wouldn't do unless it's part of their CSL. On the issue of the debt restructuring, again, I go back to it. I agree with you 100%. What Ghana did was horrific. However, in terms of the quality of your debt, even your creditors, if you have a credible plan on how you restructure your debt, not saying, hey, whatever paper you're holding, we're not going to honor it or we're going to change it. But if you get longer tenor borrowing and you have instruments that you issue that some of those same creditors could buy or swap if they want to, then you have more space to breathe. They would also be more comfortable in terms of the risk of default. We were just downgraded a couple of months ago. We're already junk status and we're going deeper into it. Better restructuring that reflects the revenue to servicing that debt over a longer term would improve ranking, and therefore the paper that the current creditors are holding. Now, in terms of the path to fiscal sustainability, I think I mentioned some things already. Opeyemi mentioned things, echoed that as well. And there's some consensus around that. The issue now is what is pragmatic. So removing the subsidy is necessary, but obviously it would have an impact. Increasing tax collection, if you're not expanding the net, right, would also have some cooling effect on the economy, right? But so you have to get people who are outside the net as well before increasing your collection and try to plug leakages, and they're substantial. Now, the other thing that we've not said that I think is absolutely critical, and I'm not trying to be reductive here, but in a very basic sense, if you scrap the second window and you allow the foreign exchange rates merge and you try to maintain a single window, that singular action would increase government revenue by double digits. What do I mean by this? So the government is selling foreign exchange right now at 420, whatever rate they're using officially. Their revenue comes off that. If that rate goes up to 550 or wherever the market is measured 600, in a very simplistic sense, their revenue would increase substantially. So again, I think back to the things we said about oil production, stopping oil theft, running a single exchange window, right, and then getting rid of some of these subsidies will dramatically change the revenue profile, and then we'll deal with that. But the most important thing, and I think Egie or Opeyemi mentioned this earlier on, is the long-term productivity of the country. So if we don't, one of the tragedies of the last 8 years is that we've been so busy managing debt that we've, apart from a few transportation projects, we've sort of abandoned increasing the productivity of the economy. And if we still need to do this, we can't run away from that. And the good news is that there are many low-hanging fruits in this respect. There's a lot of business friction. So if that friction is minimized, then you're going to see higher productivity. And then there are more long-term things we could do around talent, human capital, and certain industries are already showing great potential. Government has been a constraint to some of these industries, right? And just changing that doesn't cost money. Just getting out of the way would unlock some productivity in those areas that would generate employment, increase GDP growth, which in effect would increase government revenue through taxation. The more revenue you make as a company or the private sector makes, the more taxes they pay. So I think that is the ultimate part of fiscal sustainability. Short-term interventions, like I mentioned, and then long-term productivity increases.
Okay, let me bring Opeyemi in here.
I wanted to make a quick point so that we don't come across as textbook economists and policy experts who are not aware of the social consequences of their actions. What makes the job of Nigeria's next president, what makes the job of the next president of Nigeria difficult? It's not these policy issues. The policy imperatives are clear and the actions are clear. It's the fact that you are going to be required to do this at a time your poverty rate has got to 63%, your unemployment has got to maybe, I'm sure the latest unemployment data are dated and they're no longer correct. Yeah. It's probably over 40%.
Inflation seems to
you have a breakdown in infrastructure, you have all of these social challenges, insurrection, poverty, all of that. Yeah. So in that context, you are going to be required to make difficult exchange rates go up, subsidies, oil prices go up, and all of that. How are you able to navigate those difficult policy issues in the context of that social crisis? Do you have the lever, the political will, the political pragmatism, charisma, and all of that to get those things through without setting up the country in flames? Yeah. Jonathan tried to do a policy that I 100% supported, deregulate the oil subsidy, but the country blew up in his face and he had to reverse himself. So that will be the biggest challenge. The policies are right, we know what you have to do, but can you get it done?
Getting it done seems to be a challenge for
if I can make the point, and you are speaking to the point that I made earlier, that there are so many interests in this Nigeria project, if you like, that makes that job so difficult, even when you want to make the tough choices. You talked about how we've been unable to address the fuel subsidy issue. I think we can run through pretty much every tough decision and say that there will be some people that will feel some pain. And I think the point you made about charisma is so important because I think typically that's what you will expect people to do, to give the new leader a chance and give him, say, maybe 5-6 months and see where we're at to make those tough decisions. But even when you try to do that, there is a charisma that you need to deliver that message with. I think politicians are generally skillful at that. I wonder how we would grade the leading candidates in that respect, but again, that's another question.
Because your leadership skills will go a long way to help your vision, drive your vision there. But the other area I want to bring up right now is competitiveness, making the Nigerian economy more competitive. We're looking at the AFCFTA now. Many African countries are trying to do things to make their economies more attractive to other parts of the continent here. And looking at Nigeria's edge and where we should be, how can we get to that journey?
Well, I think that that's an area I think the three of them have spoken to. I watched Bola Tinubu's, I sat in Bola Tinubu's thing at
Town hall?
At Eco Hotel, the big policy engagement with the private sector. I think they had a fairly robust view. They looked at technology, they looked at this, they had a broad-based view of entertainment, creative sector, all of that, of how to improve competitiveness in the economy. Peter Obi has also spoken a lot around that topic. He's the one who does country comparisons and tries to understand why one economy is more competitive than the other. I think Atiku is the one who has spoken least about that topic, but his pro-market policy disposition is of itself a positive investor move, which markets will react to. So again, generally happy with what they say, but we've all pointed out the limitations of what they say. And we've all recognized that in the end, it's going to be about execution. It's going to be about your political will, your political mathematics. And the political mathematics, we can be blunt and we can say up front that it will clearly be more difficult for a President Peter Obi to govern. He's not likely to have a compliant Senate, a compliant House of Reps. Is not likely to have the political weight that the two others have. And therefore, he's going to have, but if he wins, he's going to have the streets behind him.
I was just going to talk about that. Isn't that something you bring?
That is something you can lever, you can leverage to challenge or to confront your opponent. But those are the intricacies that would determine effectiveness at the end of the day. And in the end, we just have to wait till what the results tell us tomorrow.
Let me give the other guys the opportunity to respond to the question around building a competitive economy. Let me start with Chika, then Egie.
Well, I think it's obvious. Let me start by saying, preface this by saying that there are a lot of resources for any willing and committed president in Nigeria to address competitiveness. There are a lot of resources, free resources, right? But my experience from this is when it comes to competitiveness, it comes down to the commitment of the commitment and the capacity of the president of the country. So countries that have been successful in this area, there was clear commitment from the top. Now, sometimes it could be that you're, a doctrinaire, you have a certain set of beliefs and therefore you don't go this way. Sometimes it's because you just simply don't care enough for that. And I'll give you an example, it might be controversial, but one of the things that came out of memoirs and other things from 2015 was that in the period between when President Jonathan conceded to then candidate Buhari in the elections, he offered to remove the fuel subsidy. And incoming President Buhari declined because he truly believed that the subsidy wasn't real and that somehow there could be a way to reduce the prices without having a subsidy, right? So that sort of is doctrinal. If you have a statist doctrine, then you're not going to embrace competitiveness, right? So there's a lot of work that recently a bill was enacted, and there's a lot of work in this area in terms of what to do. But I'd say sort of, with all respect, somewhat superficial. The fundamental thing has to come from the president saying, I want to do this. And if the president is behind it and people realize the president is behind it, then those changes would happen. Now, in terms of the candidates and their ability to govern, I have a very contrary opinion, and it's some sort of unusual. But I like you see, when you have checks and balances in place, and you have popularity, things tend to work. When the president came in 2015, he was very popular. There was a lot of political goodwill that could have been used to drive decisions. At some point, you had the National Assembly, so of the three parties of government, the two that really matter here are the legislators and executive. And there was a healthy sort of check on them. So when your legislatures are different from the party, unless they become a deliberate stumbling block and they have to look at the people, they tend to keep you honest and you work. When Peter Obi was governor in Anambra State, the entire legislature was a different party from him. But he managed to govern, and maybe that even helped him govern better by having to look over his back, just like it happened in Zamfara with Sani Yerima as well, when he went in and it was a PDP dominated. So that I have that view. But the critical thing here is that any of these gentlemen has to have that commitment. And once civil servants and the public realize, even investors and everyone else, that you're committed to this agenda and you can build consensus around the company's agenda, then it would work.
Egie?
Yes, I think just answering the previous question, I think timing is key. The first 100 days, you have a lot of goodwill. The most difficult decisions have to be done immediately, particularly something like petrol subsidy. If you don't get it done in the first 3 months, it's probably going to have enough time to build up a position to it. In terms of competitiveness, I mean, we know a lot of the basic things like power, the roads, and a lot has to do with, again, the philosophy of the government. So, for instance, you had a lot of governments who have a philosophy that agriculture is the solution to a number of problems. I mean, I'm not sure any country that ever moved up the per capita income scales by putting more people on the farm. I mean, you're competing against tractors and buffaloes. You need to get more people educated, more people in more high income industries. And so a lot of that has to do with the philosophy from the top. There's a lot of, I mean, if you look at just one thing, like just logistics in Nigeria, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure revolution in the past 8 years, but Apapa ports are not fixed. I mean, the cost of moving a container from Apapa to Kano is far more than from Apapa to China. So where is the competitiveness there? I mean, if you can't fix the port, you can't fix Lagos about an expressway, what are you spending money on? So it has a lot to do with from the top. The very key things have to be dealt with first and lower things dealt with later. But if you deal with train tracks to nowhere first and then your major things are not fixed, then you're probably not going to become more competitive. So hopefully the next president has better advice as to what to tackle first. Not as if everything and everybody is not important, but the sequence is important. And that sequencing starts with things like petrol subsidy has to go in the first 100 days. Thank you.
I think they've said it all in terms of competitiveness, and I think I still point to this issue about charisma. I think it's something that runs through politics everywhere in the world, and we probably need a president that can sell his ideas, sell his philosophy, because there will be certainly a demand for patience to get many of these things done. So I guess we'll see how this plays out and see how Nigeria's next president navigates that.
Let's just stop this on Opeyemi if you have anything.
Yeah, the final point I would like to make that we may not have had time to look at is, what's the quality of the cabinet? I think it was Egie's last comment that reminded me of that. It's important the president gets the best advice. And so the quality of the cabinet is fundamental. And I think that this is one area in which I'm very well encouraged. I'm confident that any of those three gentlemen will be able to put together, at least in the economic sector, the finance, planning, investment, those central bank, the right quality of people, and then it will then depend on the leadership the president provides.
Yeah, earlier on we touched about on the quality of the cabinet with Bismarck Rewani, and we talked about what we could expect from that going forward. But we have quite a long lineup here. But let's get in. Let's wrap up this segment now. Thank you so much, Opeyemi Agbaje, the CEO of RTC Advisory. Virtually, we had Matthias Chika Mordi, the chairman of former chairman of United Capital, and Egie Akpata, the chairman of Skymark Partners.